Got several tonight that are gone to Long Branch, and just before we came in, the branch was getting a little longer, wasn't it? But anyway, hope you were dry coming in. I hope they're safe going down, and so glad to see you tonight. Well, we've made it to Exodus 40, right? That's the chapter we've been looking for, Exodus 40. I don't know how I'll introduce the lesson for next Sunday night, but I'll figure out something maybe. Exodus chapter 40, this is the one we've been looking for, and finally the time has come to raise the tabernacle. And it is notated in the book what day that was. Which one was it? There you go. First day, first month of the second year. And so 2 years we've been out of Egypt now, and this long discussion of the Ten Commandments and the tabernacle furnishings and the garments of the priest and the sacrifices, the anointing, all of the cleansing, the purification processes and all of that. And we get all of it done, made, ready, and we raise up the tabernacle, as it were, the poles and the curtains there on the first day of the first month of the second year. In the tabernacle, you might remember there were two parts. There was the holy place and the most holy place. The Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of the Testimony, was in the most holy place. And what was used to divide the two? A veil, right? Bonus question, what happened to that veil when Jesus died on the cross? Somebody help him. It got torn, didn't it? From top to bottom, right? Torn from top to bottom. So, of course, it would have been in the temple at that point, but same concept. The veil in the tabernacle is where it all started, to separate the holy place from the most holy place. And so, once all this was done, God wanted to manifest His presence. And so to do that, during the day, what was over the tabernacle? A pillar of clouds, right? To manifest the presence of God. And so then at night, what was over the tabernacle? A pillar of fire. And you remember that He had used those two things to guide them previously, right? So it's kind of coming full circle. They were guided by the cloud or by the fire at night when they were traveling. And so now these two qualities or whatever were coming over the tabernacle, thus proving not only the leadership and authority of God, but the very presence of God. So there it is, Exodus chapter 40. We've been through all 40 chapters one at a time. If you would like to, if you didn't get a chance this morning, many of you did, I will just remind you that if you would like to give money toward the kids, toward food for the kids, most of you know that several years ago we started just dividing it and giving it to the parents for those kids that were going. And Misty has counted them this afternoon, and there are actually 40. So I don't want to hear nothing. I did not count the attendance this morning. That was not a preacher's count because I wasn't involved, although I liked it. And whoever said we had 298 and rounded up, I appreciate it. But anyway, and so I just want you to know, I thought it was 30-something. She tells me it's 40. So there's actually 40 children that will be at convention. There's some that won't be, but anyway, the largest number we've ever had by far. And so that's very exciting. If you'd like to give that to Misty or I tonight, we'll put that with what was given this morning, and we'll divide it and give it to the parents Wednesday night. So if you'd like to do that, please do so tonight. This morning we began to talk about stewardship, and I reminded you of what Paul said to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 of what is required of a steward. It is required that a steward be found faithful, what does faithfulness look like? What is faithfulness in all things? We could talk about tonight some areas in which faithfulness is needed, and we might do some of that. We could talk about some principles that ought to guide faithfulness. Of course, we could define what faithfulness looked like, and as I mentioned this morning, I thought Brian Parker did an excellent job Monday evening at County Line defining faithfulness and what faithfulness is and how it looks. I want us to go back to the 16th chapter of the book of Luke and just remind ourselves of what the 10th and 11th verse had to say there. Luke 16, verse 10. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. When we think about life and the significance of faithfulness, I think it is imperative that we understand that life is a proving ground. Life is what God is using to help us in the training process. And you might say, well, what are we training for? What are we proving ourselves for? Well, as we learned this morning, and as we all need to be reminded very often, that the time is coming when an account, the ledger, is going to be reckoned. The time is going to come when we are going to have to bring forth the bank statement and cross-check everything and verify that everything is managed or handled properly. And that's what life is all about. That ought to be the most important thing in our lives. And so when I'm asked, what is faithfulness, I just kind of start with the recognition that it's not about how much or how little. It's about the understanding that I am in a process here to prove myself before God. We can get into the what-ifs and how-ifs and how-tos of faithfulness, and I guess we could be here all night. And if I were to ask you to make your list of what's the top 5 things that make a person a faithful Christian, I would dare say that the person across the pew from you their top 5 would look a little different. And the reality of it is that all of it could be right. You see, we often come to topics like this and we say, okay, we want to be faithful, all right? And that's great. That's good. We do. We want to be faithful. So God, give us a list of faithfulness, right? And it just doesn't exist in that form. You know, it's almost like if we could just get God to list his top 5, maybe, then we would have the list. But in reality, it takes on many different forms, and it molds and meshes itself to fit a lot of different circumstances in life. And at the end of the day, instead of trying to say, okay, have I done these 5 things? Perhaps we would be better served in asking ourselves at the end of every day, have I proven myself to be a worthy servant? Now, I understand that at the end of the best day, I'm still unworthy. I'm not discounting that. I understand that at the end of the best day, I'm still depending upon the mercy and the grace of God through the blood of Jesus Christ. I'm not ignoring any of that. I'm just simply asking you to analyze, if you really want to measure faithfulness, did I use today to prove to God that I am of the quality that he desires? And forget 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Because today might have 15 or 18, and tomorrow might only have 1 or 2. And each day might be different and look different. And what it takes to be faithful today might change a little as to what it takes to be faithful tomorrow. And so we ebb and flow with that, and we understand that it's important even in the very little things. Even in the least of things. I keep going back in my mind, and I know I overuse this passage, but I love Matthew 25. It's a great chapter, right? And it just lays things out very clearly. And at the end of that chapter, when Jesus says, when you've done it unto the least of these. So at the end of the day, I want to be faithful in all things. What does that look like? What does it mean to be, is stewardship just about money and possessions? Well, I hope not. Does it mean that if I manage my bank account well, then I'm faithful? Well, I hope our vision is not that narrowed or tunneled. There's a whole lot more to faithfulness. And to think about the idea that Jesus presents there, when you use yourself to serve the least among you, then you truly have been a servant. Not just a servant, but have been faithful. It doesn't matter whether it's a lot or whether it's a little, because the one who is faithful in a little will be faithful in a lot, or is dishonest in a little will be the same with much. If then you have not been faithful in unrighteous wealth, who will trust true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful, verse 12, in that which is another, then who is going to give you that which is your own? And so the idea behind all of these verses here is that idea of proving oneself. It may be that you and I don't have more because we haven't proven that we can handle more. It may be that God hasn't given us more. I don't know. I can't speak for God. But what I do understand is that God is requiring us to be faithful, and how well we prove ourselves can determine that. Well, what do we know about faithfulness? Well, we come back to the 12th chapter of the same book, and we follow that whole watchfulness paragraph that we looked at last Sundays a week ago now, and we come down to verse 41, and verse 42 rather, and the Bible reading began in verse 44. And verse 44 says, truly I tell you, the one who does this is blessed. Well, the one who does what? Well, what we learn first off from this little paragraph is that God rewards faithfulness. We already knew that, didn't we? When we prove ourselves to be accountable, to be responsible, to be dependable, to be trustworthy, then God rewards, because he starts in verse 42 by saying, who then is faithful and the wise manager? And when his master sets him over his household, he gives a portion of the food at the proper time. Blessed is that servant, Luke 12 and verse 43, whom the master finds doing just that when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. So there is an increase or a blessing or a reward for proving oneself to be faithful. He's given him charge over the food portions. So he's the cafeteria manager, right? Well, it's an important job, isn't it? It better be. What the master's trying to see is it important enough, right? Well, I'll just shirk this responsibility because after all I am is the cafeteria manager, right? I mean, these people, they old enough to get their own food if they want food, you know. They'll take care of themselves. I mean, after all, I should have been the head of security, but here I am, the head of the cafeteria. The master's trying to figure out, is that your attitude? Is that your attitude with God? Because if it is, then you're not proving yourself. Not only are you not being faithful, but you're not proving yourself that you can be faithful in all things. God's looking for the one who says, Okay, God, you want me to put food before people? That's fine. That's great. I'll do it. I'll fix the best meal I can. I'll make sure everybody gets a proper portion, and I'll make sure there's enough to feed everybody. I'll do the best job I can do. Oh, it's not the coolest job in the shed. It's not the most desired job in the castle, but somebody's got to do it. It works the same way if we take this and apply it spiritually, doesn't it? Some jobs or some responsibilities or some obligations may be less desirable than others. But God is saying, will you prove yourself there? If you will, then I'll reward you. How so? I'll give you more to handle. In this case, in Luke 12, all of his possessions. I mean, if he can't handle the cafeteria, I sure don't want him over security, right? Far too often we convince ourselves that the position we have is not important. We're going to come back around to this idea as we close tonight. So he says in verse 45, what if that servant says to himself, my master ain't come back in a while, and so I think I'll just start beating the male and female servants. Well, this ain't going to work out very well, because those people carry about the job that needs to be done that provides the livelihood for the master, right? They're the ones that are actually doing the work to keep the money, to keep the ability to buy the possessions that he has, or to upkeep or to maintain them or whatever. And so you start messing with my servants, you start messing with my livelihood. You start messing with my ability to maintain the status quo, but he's decided that's what I'll start doing. And he eats and he drinks and he gets drunk. And verse 46 reminds us of a very real reality, is that God doesn't always come wanting our account when we expect it. Far too often, God comes testing us at the time when we least expect it. So when is faithfulness required, right? All times. Faithful in all things at all times, because the master will come on a day when he doesn't expect, in an hour that he doesn't know, and then it gets graphic. He'll cut him into pieces and he'll put him with the unfaithful. So from Luke 12 we learn that God is going to reward the faithful. We also learn that God is going to punish the unfaithful. Well, that's real deep and theological, isn't it? And the accounting will come at a time when you least expect it. It's going to catch you off guard. It's going to be when you're not paying attention. And you say, well, okay then, we need to pay attention all the time. That's exactly the point, right? So every day is an opportunity to prove oneself. And so at the end of the day, don't ask yourself, did I check off all the boxes on my faithfulness list? But rather ask yourself the question, did I use this day to prove to my God that I want to be faithful? You're not going to be perfect. You're not going to be flawless. So you better not ask those questions. Because if you ask God, was I perfect today? The answer will and always will be no. Well, God, was I flawless? No, you were not. God, I didn't make any mistake. Yes, you did. You're going to fail, and so am I. So there's got to be something else that has to maintain our focus. And as I understand faithfulness and this idea of proving oneself, and you just boil it down very simply to rewarding those who do well, punishing those who do not. And then verse 47 introduces something rather interesting, and I want us to kind of think about this for the rest of our time this evening. And that servant who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. Okay, so let's just break it down, and here's what it says. The guy knows what the master's will is. Okay, verse 46 seems to end for me and that guy's been cut to pieces and put among the unfaithful. All right? So he's given his account, and it didn't work out well, and he's been punished. And now it's almost, in my mind, as Jesus says, let me give you one more thing to think about. And so it's almost like he introduces a new section, if you will, to this discussion in verse 47. If a guy knows what his master's will is, if he knows what his master wants, and he doesn't do it, when his master comes, he will receive a severe beating. Now look at verse 48. But to the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating, he will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given of him, much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. And we come there, and Matthew renders it a little different, and by the way, Matthew's is, in my opinion, much more complicated, because it's like the one who doesn't have much is going to take away and give, and you remember that passage. And so, but here's the point in verse 48. There's a second guy who doesn't seem to know what the master's will is. And he's going to get a beating because he done what was deserving of a beating. But it's going to be a lighter beating. Verse 47, that guy's going to get a severe beating. Verse 48, the second guy is going to get a light beating. And then he closes by saying, to whom much is given, much is required, and to whom much is entrusted, much will be demanded. And so I just want to pause right here, and I just want us to realize, I want us to step back and to think about, and I am the furthest person to even try to engage in this conversation, but I do know that there are those firmly convicted in levels of heaven and hell. And there being degrees of punishment and degrees of reward. And here's the way I leave it, okay? If you're in heaven, you'll know you're in heaven, and if you're in hell, you'll know you're in hell, okay? That's where I leave it personally. Now, you can call me a dummy or just say that I'm trying to oversimplify something. Do I think the Bible teaches the possibility of levels? The answer is yes. Do I understand it enough to try to explain it? The answer is no. All right? So there it is. You ready to go home? Me too. But it's clear in verse 47 and 48 that there are two different punishments handed out for the same violation. Now, let me repeat. There are two different punishments handed out for the same. What is the violation? I don't know, other than he didn't do what his master wanted him to do, right? And it appears from verse 48 that the second guy did the same thing. The problem with the second guy, or the interesting caveat to this thing here, is he didn't know what the master's will was. And so therefore, because he didn't know, for you guys that are in the Romans class, it's been 2.5 months ago now, I guess, we were beginning the book of Romans, and I asked about different levels for different people who had never heard the gospel. And we had a little discussion about that. For some of you guys that might have been in there might remember that. I believe that God is merciful. I believe that God is gracious. I believe that God is just. And I know that God is righteous. And so with all those things packaged in, whatever God does is going to be righteously just, okay? But it appears to me that there tends to be a variation here. And so then I began to ask, okay, well, what brings about the variation? Well, that's pretty straightforward. In Luke 12, verse 47, 48, one man knew the will, one man did not. So here's what I've concluded. And if you'd like to discuss this further privately, I'd be happy to do that. But here's what I've concluded. Ability plus opportunity equals responsibility. That's what I've concluded. So based on your ability and based on your opportunity, now what does that say? That says that everybody in the room has a different ability. It also says that everybody in the room has a different level of opportunity. But when you put those together, what you get is your responsibility. For example, you live in Middle Tennessee in the United States of America. It's been free for over 200 years now. The Bible is readily printed and the Bible is readily circulated, and you are free to read your Bible, to open your Bible anywhere you want to go. You can't be punished. You have the freedom of religion. You live in that country, and so do I. Therefore, you and I have a different opportunity set than someone who lives in a country that is not free. Meaning, therefore, that in the equation, you and I have a different responsibility than someone who lives in a country where they are not free. Now, we're going to all be held accountable. Don't misunderstand me. Both of these servants were held accountable, but one received a different punishment than the other. Because the first one, in verse 47, it's the only way I know to see it. And if I'm wrong, you can tell me later that I'm wrong. But he had all the ability and the opportunity to get it right, and he didn't. He knew what the will was. He had the ability to complete the will, but he refused to do it. And because of that, his responsibility level increased. Therefore, his punishment increased. When you come to verse 48, the guy didn't have the same ability as the first one because he didn't know what the will of the master was. But what he did was something deserving of a beating, and he got what he deserved, but it was on a different level, if you will. So how does all this tie to faithfulness? Well, let me ask you, what is your responsibility? That's how your faithfulness is determined by your level of responsibility, or how well you accept and live up to your level of responsibility. What is your level of responsibility determined by? Your ability and your opportunity. So the greater your ability, the greater your responsibility. The greater your opportunity, the greater your responsibility. And obviously, God knows every bit of that. So, as we close tonight, what does it mean to be faithful in all things? Well, we need to understand what faithfulness looks like as it relates to the church. We need to be faithful to the church, right? Ephesians 3 and verse 21, to him be glory, right? So in other words, to him who is able to do above and beyond what we could ever ask or think, the one that is working within us, Ephesians 3 and verse 20, the one that is empowering us, to him be glory in the church. That our lives might be used and that we might be empowered by him to be faithful to him, so that the church, so that God might receive the glory both now and forever. You flip over into the 4th chapter of that same book in Ephesians chapter 4, down about verse 12, it talks about equipping the saints for ministry. For what purpose? For the building up of the church. I need to use my ability and my opportunity to feel a responsibility to the Lord's church. What does it mean to be faithful in all things? What does that look like? How does that manifest itself? Every one of us in this room have blessings. We all have good gifts that come from above, from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shadow of turning, James says. And so Jesus says in Mark 10 and verse 29, if anyone hasn't left father or mother or houses or lands, all that's blessings, right? If anyone hasn't considered me more valuable than those things, then Jesus says in Mark 10 and verse 30, they're not worthy. So what does it mean to be faithful in all things? We need to use the abilities that God has blessed us with the opportunities that God puts in front of us with our blessings, so that we feel responsible to use our blessings to prove ourselves to God that we want to be faithful. What does it look like to be faithful in all things? Well, if we just go then to the equation itself, what does opportunity mean? And where are your opportunities? And will you be faithful to your opportunities? Or will you shirk your opportunity? As you have opportunity, do good unto all, especially those of the household of faith, Galatians 6 and verse 10. As you have opportunity, do we feel it important enough to take advantage of our opportunity so that we might raise our responsibility before the Lord? And may I advise you that just because you don't want to take an opportunity, don't mean that the Lord's going to say, well, that's okay, I'll give you another one down the road. No, He might not. He might say, you know what, if you're not going to take this opportunity, I won't give you any more. There was your opportunity. And because you weren't faithful and didn't feel responsible in that opportunity, to which then we come to the idea of ability. This is not about, well, let me back up. If this is about what's the least I can get by with, you're trying to live the wrong life. You've signed up for the wrong thing. I got it. It's a Sunday night crowd, okay? But I'm just saying that there can be people in the Sunday night crowd who have signed up to try to get by with the least they can get by with, and that's not what this is about. The goal here is to raise the responsibility. Well, if I don't do much, I won't be accountable for much, and therefore God can't hold me to much. He'll just cast you in the pit of darkness and get rid of you. If that's the attitude, then just that's what it'll be. Rather, the attitude should be, I want to grow in my responsibility to the Lord and in my accountability, in my faithfulness. How do I do that? I look for opportunities to use my abilities. And did you hear how Luke 12 and verse 48 ended? To the one that is given much, more will even be demanded. What does that mean? As I use my abilities, God will bless me with more abilities. I'm trying to raise my level of responsibility out there, and to do that in this equation, I'm adding to my ability, which is having a direct correlation to my responsibility. And the way I add to my ability is by being faithful in the ones that God has given me, so that He'll give me more. And so Romans 12 and verse 3 begins by saying, let no man think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but let each one use the gifts that he has been given. And then he goes through about 5 or 6 there. Whatever gifts whatever abilities you have been given, be faithful in those abilities, and God will bless you with more, and as a result, your responsibility will rise in the eyes of God, because you have proven yourself to be faithful. Whatever else it all means, Jesus said to the church in Asia in Revelation 2 and verse 10, be faithful. Be faithful to the point of death, and I'll give you a crown of life. What's He want? He wants you to be faithful. He wants me to be faithful. What does faithfulness in all things look like? I want you to be able to lay your head on your pillow tonight and say with confidence, I've worked hard today to prove to my God that I want to be a worthy servant. If you can't, I'm begging you to come as we stand and sing.